There are prayers we love to sing because they sound beautiful and safe. Bless me, guide me, open doors for me. And there are prayers quietly we avoid, even while calling ourselves surrendered. Do whatever you must do in me, even if it breaks me. We rarely say it out loud, but deep in the soul, there is a line we do not want God to cross. We want to be transformed, but not at any cost. We want holiness, as long as it does not touch the parts of our life we still secretly hope to keep. Imagine, then, a man like Jonathan Edwards, brilliant theologian, pastor, and instrument in the hands of God during a season of awakening. We admire him from a distance, as if he lived permanently on some higher spiritual mountain. But the Jonathan Edwards who walked alone with God was not made of marble. He was a man who trembled at what the holiness of God might require. He knew that to really pray, "Search me, O God," was to invite a fire that would not stop at the surface. It would burn down into motives, affections, ambitions, desires. Edwards believed that the human heart is deceitful above all things, not only in its obvious sins, but in its ability to dress self-love in spiritual language. He feared not only gross outward evil, but the subtle corruption that could wrap itself in sermons, success, and even religious fervor. And so, there was a particular kind of prayer that stood before him like a doorway he was almost afraid to walk through. The prayer that gives God permission, not that he needs it, but that we acknowledge it, to do whatever is necessary to purify the soul. No matter the cost to comfort, reputation, or plans, you know more of this fear than you might admit. There are moments when the Spirit nudges you toward deeper surrender and something in you pulls back. You sense that if you really said, "Lord, take away what keeps me from you," he might actually do it. What if it is a relationship? What if it is a hidden sin that has quietly become your refuge? What if it is a dream you have carried for years? We are comfortable asking God to bless our path. We are far less comfortable asking him to overturn the table of our plans if they stand in the way of our sanctification. Jonathan Edwards stood in that tension. He had tasted enough of God to know that his presence is better than anything this world can offer, but he had also seen enough of his own heart to know that it would cling to lesser loves unless God intervened. The prayer he feared was simple in words and terrifying in implication. "Lord, do with me whatever will most glorify you and conform me to Christ, even if it means undoing the life I would have chosen." It is one thing to affirm that sentence in a theology book. It is another to kneel down and whisper it into the ear of the living God. This is where the story begins for us. Not with a spiritual giant striding confidently into sacrifice, but with a man who knows that God's love is not tame. Divine love does not merely comfort, it cleanses. It does not only soothe, it sometimes wounds in order to heal. To truly invite that love to have its way is to surrender control over the script of your own story. Edwards hesitated at that threshold, not because he doubted God's goodness, but because he understood it too well. A good God will not leave a single idol standing if he has set his love upon a soul. Maybe you are standing at a similar doorway. You believe in God, you serve him, you sing about surrender, but there is still a quiet line you hope he will not cross. As we walk through this message, we are going to step into Jonathan Edwards' fear and into the moment when he finally bowed under that dangerous prayer. Not to make a legend out of him, but to hold up a mirror to our own half-surrenders. Because somewhere in your story, there is a sentence you have avoided praying. And it may be that the destiny you keep asking God to fulfill on your terms will only be unlocked when you dare to say with open hands, "Do in me whatever you must, even if it is nothing like what I planned." Jonathan Edwards did not fear that prayer because he thought God was cruel. He feared it because he knew God was serious. When a holy God takes a soul at its word, he does not sign a contract to improve your life slightly. He commits himself to conforming you to the image of his Son, and that process will not politely avoid your idols. Edwards had seen in Scripture that when God answers the prayer, "Search me," he often does it through circumstances that dismantle false security, expose hidden motives, and strip away the comforts we secretly love more than him. He also knew how skilled the heart is at bargaining. We say, "Lord, use me," but we mean, "Use me in ways that affirm me." We say, "Take my life," but we quietly add footnotes, "Just do not touch this relationship, this dream, this reputation." Edwards wrote about the terrifying capacity of the soul to love God for his benefits while still clinging to itself as the ultimate center. To pray, "Do what you must," without conditions, was to invite God to test whether his love was truly God-centered or still orbiting around his own comfort and success. This is where the fear sharpens. What if God answers that prayer by closing doors that everyone else calls opportunities? What if he allows seasons of dryness where no emotion carries you and all you have is naked faith? What if he uses criticism to crush your dependence on human praise, or loss to detach your fingers from a dream you made into an idol? Edwards had read Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6. "For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives." He understood that discipline is not theoretical. It lands in real events, real losses, real tears. At the same time, he could not escape another truth. To refuse that prayer was also to choose a path. Saying, "Do not do whatever it takes," is itself a kind of request. It is a plea to be left alone at certain depths, to be improved but not remade. Edwards saw that as the most dangerous wish a believer could entertain. To be left with comfortable sins, unchallenged idols, and untested loyalties is not mercy. It is a slow judgment. The very thing that felt scary, God's willingness to intervene at any cost, was also the only guarantee that he would not drift into a polished, religious ruin. So for a time, he lived in that inner standoff. His theology pulled him toward full surrender. His humanity pulled him back toward a safer devotion. He preached about the deceitfulness of the heart and felt his own dodging conviction. He expounded on sanctification and felt the Spirit aiming the same truth at him. The prayer he feared was like a line written at the bottom of a page he was reluctant to sign. "Lord, do not obey my instincts, obey your wisdom. Do not preserve what you know must die. Do not protect the parts of me I would protect. Make me holy, no matter what it costs." You have felt that same tug of war. Perhaps you have already mouthed words like, "Have your way in me," and then felt a quiet panic. What if he really does? Maybe you have seen what happens when God takes someone seriously. He calls them out of relationships that were convenient, out of careers that were comfortable, out of patterns that felt safe. From the outside, we call it obedience and admire the story. From the inside, it looks like being led where you would never have walked if you had been allowed to stay in control. It is understandable that part of you resists praying the sentence that could start such a journey. Yet Edwards began to realize something crucial. The prayer itself does not create God's sovereignty. It simply stops pretending that you can escape it. God is already able to do what he wills in your life. The difference is whether you will meet his hand with resistance or with yielded trust. Refusing to pray, "Do what you must," does not make him weaker. It makes you harder. It trains your soul to treat his interventions as intrusions instead of mercy. The real risk, he saw, was not that God would answer that dangerous prayer, but that he might leave a man comfortably untouched by it. Slowly, under that realization, the fear began to change shape. It did not vanish, but it was joined by a deeper dread. The thought of arriving at the end of his life with gifts exercised, sermons preached, and a heart only half given. Edwards feared being admired by people while remaining partially withheld from God. That picture terrified him more than the prospect of suffering under God's refining hand. And somewhere in that holy discomfort, The prayer he had been avoiding moved from the edge of his mind to the center of his wrestling. It would not leave him alone, because the God who inspired it was not willing to leave him half-surrendered. There came a day when Jonathan Edwards realized that he could no longer live in the gap between what he preached and what he dared to ask for himself. Week after week, he urged his people to give God their whole hearts, to hold nothing back from the one who had purchased them with blood. He preached that it is better to enter life maimed than to be whole and cast into hell, better to lose everything than to keep one darling sin. And yet, when he was alone, there were still corners of his own soul where he hoped God would be gentle, slow, hesitant to disturb. That awareness did not come to him in a single dramatic vision. It grew over time, like a pressure building under the surface. In prayer, he found himself stopping just short of certain phrases. He could say, "Lord, lead me," easily enough. He could say, "Use my life for your glory," with conviction. But when the Spirit pressed him toward the unqualified words, "Do whatever you must with me," his tongue grew heavy. He felt as if those words were a door with no handle on the inside. Once spoken, they could not be taken back. A holy God would treat them as permission to burn away anything that stood between his glory and that human heart. Two passages haunted him especially. One was Psalm chapter 139, verses 23 and 24. "Search me, O God, and know my heart, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." The other was Christ's own call in the Gospels to deny oneself, take up the cross, and follow him. Edwards knew these were not poetic metaphors for minor adjustments. To pray, "Search me," was to invite invasive examination. To take up a cross was to accept the death of whatever the flesh clung to most. The more he meditated on these texts, the more he felt exposed by his own reluctance. One evening, whether in his study or walking alone in the fields near his home or kneeling by his bed, only God and his journal truly know, the conflict reached a point where it could no longer be postponed. He felt the weight of his calling bearing down. A preacher who calls others to full surrender cannot make permanent treaties with his own reservations. He saw, too, the kindness of God in refusing to let him settle. The fear was still there, but it now stood alongside a deeper fear of grieving the one who had given him everything. Between comfort and holiness, he knew which had eternal weight. So he began to speak, not with dramatic eloquence, but with the halting honesty of a man who has run out of places to hide. He confessed first his reluctance, the fact that he had been afraid of what God might take, afraid of what God might change, afraid of what obedience might cost. Then, with the help of grace, he crossed the sentence that had stood like a line in the sand. He said, in substance, if not in those exact English words, "Lord, I surrender to you the right to do with me whatever most glorifies you and most conforms me to Christ. Break what you must break, remove what you must remove. Only do not leave me to myself." He did not feel an instant wave of romantic emotion. There may have been tears, there may have been silence. The point is not whether he felt heroic, but that he finally stopped negotiating. For the first time, he signed his name under a blank page and handed it to God. The prayer he had feared had become the only honest response to a God he claimed to trust. In that moment, surrender was not a song lyric. It was a transaction between a trembling creature and an unshakable Lord. What changed immediately was not his external circumstances, but the axis of his heart. Until then, he had often asked, "Lord, bless what I am doing." Now another question rose to the center. "Lord, do whatever will make me truly yours." He still planned, studied, and labored, but underneath those efforts ran a deeper willingness. "If you must overturn this to save me from myself, do it." The fear of pain did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by a new fear, the fear of a life that looks fruitful and admired, yet is only partially yielded. You may never write resolutions or lead a revival, but the battle is not so different in you. There is probably a sentence you have avoided praying because you suspect it will change more than you feel ready to lose. It might be, "Lord, end this relationship if it keeps me from you." It might be, "Close any door that feeds my pride." It might be, "Take from me whatever I cannot handle without idolizing." Like Edwards, you already know enough of God to recognize that he will take those words seriously. That is precisely why you hesitate. The question is whether you believe his love is safer than your control. Jonathan Edwards reached a point where he decided that the most dangerous thing in his life was not what God might ask of him, but what might happen if God stopped asking. The prayer he feared became the doorway to a different kind of destiny, not one defined by ease, but one guarded by a God who refuses to leave his children half transformed. In the next part, we will begin to trace how that prayer began to shape the course of Edwards's life, and how the same surrender, whispered in your own weakness, could change far more than you imagine. When a man truly prays, "Do whatever you must," the first thing God often transforms is not his circumstances, but his measuring stick. Before that surrender, Jonathan Edwards could still, at times, quietly evaluate his life the way most of us do, by visible fruit, ministry influence, intellectual achievement, the respect of his peers. After that prayer, he began to see those things as secondary to a different question. Is God using these to make me more like Christ, or are they becoming substitutes for Christ? The same events that once felt like simple successes or failures now became instruments in the hand of a sovereign surgeon. That shift gave a different color to both encouragement and hardship. When sermons were received with power, when people were moved, when revival stirred, Edwards did not simply celebrate the results. He read them as fresh opportunities to test his heart. Do these things push me toward deeper humility, or do they inflate a hidden pride? When criticism came, when opposition rose, when confusion or disappointment visited his ministry, he no longer saw those experiences chiefly as obstacles. They became possible answers to the prayer he had finally dared to pray. God allowing blows that would detach his identity from applause and force his roots deeper into grace. Over time, his preaching reflected this interior transformation. He had always spoken of God's sovereignty and holiness, but now his words carried an even weightier intimacy. He was not only explaining doctrines, he was describing realities that had dismantled him personally. When he warned his hearers about clinging to idols, it was not from a safe distance. He had felt the chisel of God breaking his own attachments. When he invited them to yield their lives fully, he was not selling them an idea. He was inviting them into a fire he himself had entered. That authenticity gave his sermons an authority no mere eloquence can produce. This surrender also prepared him for trials he could not have anticipated. There would be seasons when the very people he had poured himself out for would misunderstand or reject him. There would be decisions, born of conscience and conviction, that cost him position, security, and comfort. A man who had never asked God to do whatever most glorifies you would have seen those moments purely as tragedy. Edwards, however imperfectly, had already signed his life over. He could wrestle, grieve, and even weep before God, and yet still say, "If this loss is part of your answer to that prayer, if this is how you keep me from a subtler ruin, then do not stop." This does not mean he became superhuman. The process was not clean, linear, or easy. There were certainly days when he felt the sting more sharply than the purpose, moments when the cost seemed disproportionate. Sanctification does not erase the ache of being pruned, it reframes it. What changed was that Edwards now had a lens through which to interpret the pain. He no longer saw hard providences as random storms or purely satanic attacks. He could acknowledge the enemy's malice and people's sins, yet still look above them to a Father answering a dangerous, faithful request in a way no one else could fully trace. The same principle quietly reaches into your life. When you avoid that kind of prayer, every difficulty feels like an interruption to the real story you are trying to write. When you embrace it, even with trembling, hardship can become part of the story God is writing to answer your own invitation. A closed door is no longer only disappointment, it might be protection. A season of dryness is no longer only failure, it might be a recalibration away from feelings and back to faith. A loss is no longer only grief, it might be the severing of an attachment that was quietly stealing your heart. None of this romanticizes suffering. Jonathan Edwards did not float above sorrow, and neither will you. Jesus himself in the garden prayed, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me," and then added, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." True surrender holds both halves of that prayer together, honest desire and yielded will. The point of the dangerous prayer is not to erase your humanity, but to align it with a deeper trust. You are not asked to enjoy every wound. You are invited to believe that no wound is wasted when it falls under the hand of a wise Redeemer. As this takes root, a subtle but profound freedom begins to grow. You become less desperate to control outcomes because you have already handed the pen of your story to someone better. You still plan, work, and choose, but beneath each effort there is a quiet echo. "Lord, override me if I am leading myself away from you." Answer the deeper prayer, not the shallow one. That is how a single sentence, prayed in fear and faith, begins to transform a destiny. Not by guaranteeing an easy path, but by anchoring a life to a God who would rather break your plans than let your soul be lost. In the next part, we will move from Edwards' story more directly into yours, into what it might mean for you in your specific relationships, dreams, and fears, to step across the line from safer prayers into the risky, liberating confession. "Do in me whatever most glorifies you, even if it is nothing like what I imagined." Sooner or later, your story has to step into this conversation. It's one thing to watch Jonathan Edwards wrestle with a dangerous prayer from a safe distance, and another to admit that the same line is drawn across your own life. You may not frame it in theological language, but you know the feeling. There is a part of you that wants God to move in power, and a part of you that silently hopes He will not touch certain areas. There are relationships you want Him to bless but not question. There are habits you want Him to forgive but not uproot. There are dreams you want Him to fund, not filter. If you slow down long enough, you can probably name some of those protected places. Maybe it is a relationship that God has already started to trouble with conviction, even while your emotions insist on keeping it. Maybe it is a secret pattern hidden behind ministry or busyness that you excuse because everyone struggles. And maybe it is an image of your future that has become so fused with your identity that you cannot imagine being truly yourself without it. Whatever it is, the thought of saying, "Lord, if this keeps me from you, take it," feels less like surrender and more like stepping off a cliff. This is where the honesty of Scripture confronts us. Luke chapter 9, verse 23, records Jesus saying, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Crosses are not accessories, they are instruments of death. To take one up is to accept that something will not survive this journey. When Jonathan Edwards finally prayed, "Do whatever most glorifies you in me," he was not adding a spiritual flourish to his life. He was agreeing with Christ that true discipleship will cost him something precious, perhaps many things. The same is true for you. At the same time, this call is not an invitation into random suffering. God is not asking you to throw your life into chaos just to prove a point. He is asking whether you trust His diagnosis of your soul more than your own. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. That means there are attachments and desires in you that feel right, feel safe, feel essential, and yet, from God's perspective, are quietly poisoning your walk. The dangerous prayer is simply this: Lord, I believe your assessment of me more than I believe my feelings about me. Do what you know is necessary. For some, that may mean praying specifically into an area you have kept off limits. Lord, if this relationship is dulling my hunger for you, then end it, even if it breaks my heart. If this path I call calling is really about my pride, then close these doors and redirect me. If this hidden sin is killing my soul while I entertain it, then expose it rather than let me keep wearing a mask. These words are terrifying because they hand over control, but they are also liberating because they stop forcing you to be the sole protector of your own future. Here is where you have to ask yourself a question that Edwards eventually asked: what do I actually believe is more dangerous, God's scalpel or my own stubbornness? If you believe that God's love is holy and wise, then the real nightmare is not that he will answer a prayer of surrendered obedience. The real nightmare is that he might, for a time, let you have your way. Romans chapter 1 verse 24 speaks of God giving them up to their own desires as a form of judgment. To be lovingly opposed by God is painful. To be left alone in your illusions is far worse. There is grace even in the way you move toward this. Jonathan Edwards did not arrive at that prayer in a single, fearless leap. He edged toward it through conviction, wrestling, and a growing sense that half surrender was choking his joy. You can begin the same way. Start by telling God the truth. I am afraid of what I am about to say. Then name the fear. Then in the very same breath say, yet I believe you are better than what I am clinging to. So I choose your wisdom over my preferences. Do what most glorifies you and do not let me sabotage my own soul. As you pray this, do not be surprised if the Spirit begins to put his finger on very concrete things. The prayer you fear will not stay abstract for long. That is not God being cruel. That is God answering. A conversation you have avoided may suddenly feel urgent. A compromise you tolerated may become unbearable. A door you were certain would open may close with no explanation. When that happens, you will be tempted to panic and say, "This is not what I meant." But if you can pause and remember Edward's path, you may begin to see these shifts as the first fruits of a mercy you invited, even if you did not fully understand it at the time. Somewhere in this process, a turning happens. You stop only asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What if this is part of the answer to the prayer I finally dared to pray?" That question does not explain away every pain, and it does not make loss easy, but it frames your story inside a larger reality. You are no longer the only one fighting for your soul. You have asked a relentless, loving God to intervene, and he has taken you seriously. In the next part, we will begin to explore how that awareness can reshape the way you walk through present trials, not as random storms, but as part of a severe, beautiful mercy that is committed to changing your destiny at the deepest level. When you begin to see your trials as possible answers to a prayer you once feared to pray, the landscape of your life shifts. Things that used to feel like pure interruption now demand a second look. That closed door that left you angry, that friendship that cooled, that opportunity that dissolved. Before you only asked, "Why did this happen?" Now another question quietly rises. What if this is God refusing to let me build my life on something that would have destroyed me? You may not be ready to thank him for it yet, but you are not able to dismiss it as random anymore. This is where Jonathan Edwards' dangerous prayer begins to show its power. He had asked God to do whatever most glorified him and most conformed him to Christ. After that, he could not simply interpret his life by the grid of comfort. When criticism came, he had to ask, is this part of how God is humbling my love of reputation? When dryness came, is this weaning me from living on emotion? When loss came, is this weakening the roots of an idol? He did not pretend to know the full mind of God, but he refused to assume that pain was always proof of God's displeasure. Sometimes it was proof of a love that refused to leave him shallow. This perspective is not natural. It is born from Scripture. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, tells us that God disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness, and that for the moment, discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Discipline is not God losing patience, it is God refusing to abandon his project. When you have asked him to do whatever it takes, these verses become more than theology. They become a lens through which you look at the ache in your chest and say, this may be how he is answering me. That does not mean you must pretend every hardship is directly and obviously tied to a specific sin. The book of Job stands as a warning against simplistic math. What it does mean is that you no longer see your life as a tug of war between you and fate. You have invited a Father into the deepest decisions about your soul, and he has accepted. That is why some doors stay shut no matter how hard you knock. That is why some relationships never settle into the shape you tried to force them into. That is why some habits have become too bitter to enjoy. The prayer you feared has begun to work like a hidden fire under the floorboards. As this awareness grows, your prayers themselves begin to change. Instead of praying only, Lord, make this stop, you find yourself also saying, Lord, do not let this stop until it has done in me what you intend. You still ask for relief. Jesus himself did in the garden. But you add the second half of his sentence, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. You start to pray not just for escape, but for extraction. That God would pull out of your heart whatever this trial has exposed. You are no longer satisfied with surviving a hard season. You want to come out of it less entangled, less divided, less easily seduced by what cannot save you. There is a strange strengthening that comes with this. You are still capable of being wounded, of course, but you are no longer as easily shattered by every unexpected turn. When a plan collapses, you grieve, but somewhere underneath the grief, a quiet defiance rises. My destiny is not in the hands of this plan. It is in the hands of the God I ask to take over. You become less afraid that one wrong move has ruined everything. If the Lord was willing to rearrange your life to answer your dangerous prayer, he is certainly capable of reweaving the pieces of a misstep. His commitment to your formation did not begin with your wisdom, and it will not end with your weakness. This does not make you reckless. It makes you more careful with what truly matters. You begin to fear different things. You fear a heart that stops responding more than a life that stops going according to plan. You fear making peace with a respectable idol more than you fear losing a visible blessing. You fear a comfortable distance from God more than you fear the discomfort of his nearness. That reordering of fear is itself part of how the prayer is transforming your destiny. Your external story may not look dramatic, but inside, the center of gravity is moving from self to God. If you let it, this can change how you talk about your life to others. Instead of only telling stories of open doors and obvious victories, you begin to tell the quieter testimonies. I prayed a prayer I was afraid to pray, and since then, God has been rearranging me in ways I did not choose. I would not have written it this way, but I can see him cutting things out of me that would have ruined me if they had stayed. That kind of honesty does more than inspire. It invites. It calls others out of the illusion that safety is found in controlling their own script and into the deeper safety of placing that script in the hands of a God who loves them too much to leave them untouched. There is another dimension to this dangerous prayer that we often miss. It does not only change how God deals with you, It changes how you deal with him. Before surrender, it is easy to treat God like a consultant. You bring him your plans, your blueprints, your timelines, and ask for input and blessing. If his guidance fits inside your design, you rejoice. If it does not, you quietly set it aside and keep moving. But once you have said, "Do whatever you must," you can no longer pretend you are simply asking for advice. You have acknowledged that he owns the house, the land, and the future you wanted to build there. This shift moves you from negotiation to obedience. You may still wrestle, but you wrestle as someone who knows the outcome is not supposed to be a compromise between your will and his. When the Spirit convicts you about a pattern, you no longer ask, "How little can I change and still feel okay?" You start asking, "How far does this repentance need to go if I take God seriously?" When a door closes, you do not only ask how to pry it back open. You ask, "What are you saying through this that I do not want to hear?" Your relationship with God becomes less like haggling with a landlord and more like following a shepherd you have learned to trust. This is not cold submission. It is warmed by the character of the one you are yielding to. Jonathan Edwards did not throw himself into the hands of a distant force. He surrendered to a God he had met in Christ, a God who humbled himself to death on a cross, who bore the wrath Edwards deserved, who loved him before he ever thought of loving back. The same is true for you. The God you are afraid might dismantle your plans is the God who already dismantled himself, in a sense, for your salvation. Any suffering he allows into your path passes through the nail-scarred hands of a Savior who has chosen to suffer with you and for you. This is why the dangerous prayer, rightly understood, is an act of hope, not despair. You are not saying, "Do whatever you must because nothing matters." You are saying, "Do whatever you must because eternity matters more than my comfort, holiness matters more than my image, and your presence matters more than my preferred storyline." You are betting your life on the conviction that God's vision for your joy is higher than yours, even when his methods look for a season like loss. That is not masochism. That is faith in the wisdom and goodness of a Father who sees the end from the beginning. In this light, you can begin to trace how such a prayer really can change your destiny, not in the shallow sense of guaranteeing visible success, but in the deeper sense of altering the kind of person you become. Without surrender, it is entirely possible to arrive at the end of your days with a full resume and a hollow soul. Doors opened, dreams achieved, reputation intact, and a heart still half at war with God. With surrender, you may arrive with scars, losses, and stories that did not go the way you planned. But you will also arrive having been carved into someone who actually loves what God loves and hates what he hates. That, in the end, is the destiny Scripture is most concerned with. Romans chapter 8 verse 29 says that those whom God foreknew he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. The ultimate success story of your life is not whether you checked all the boxes you drew in your 20s. It is whether over time you began to look more like Jesus in how you trust, obey, forgive, endure, and worship. Dangerous prayers are one of the chisels God uses in that sculpting. They invite him to do openly what he is already committed to doing by grace. Even knowing this, you may feel your heart resisting. Part of you hears all of this and says, "Yes, I want that," while another part whispers, "Not yet, not completely." Do not hide that conflict from God. Bring it to him. Tell him, "I'm afraid of what I'm about to pray. I like control. I like my idols. I like my plans. But I also know they cannot carry the weight of my soul. Help me to want your will more than mine." That honesty is not a disqualifier. It is the soil where real surrender grows. God is not impressed by brave words spoken from a detached heart. He is moved by trembling words spoken in truth. Somewhere in that trembling, You will have to decide whether you believe that God is better at writing your story than you are. Jonathan Edwards came to that conclusion in his own century, on his own knees, with his own fears. You must come to it in yours. The prayer that changed his destiny is not magic. It is simply a sentence that lines up your mouth with what Scripture already says about who God is and who you are. In the next part, we will draw nearer to that tipping point, into what it might sound like right now for you to echo that dangerous prayer in your own words, and how to walk forward when the first answers do not look like the blessing you expected. There is usually a quiet moment, often when no one is watching, when this whole message stops being theory and starts becoming a question pressed directly on you. It might be late at night when you realize you are exhausted from carrying the illusion of control. It might be after a disappointment when the script you wrote for your life has clearly fallen apart. It might be in worship when a line about surrender suddenly feels heavier than the melody behind it. In that moment you sense it. God is not only asking you to believe that He is sovereign, He is asking you to agree with His sovereignty over you. You could ignore it. Many do. You can drown it in noise, distract yourself with busyness, or soothe it with vague spiritual language. God knows my heart, He understands. I will get there one day. But underneath those phrases, you know something more specific is being asked. It is not just, "Do you love me?" It is, "Do you trust me enough to let me decide what must live and what must die in your story?" That is the essence of the prayer Jonathan Edwards feared and finally embraced. It is the place where doctrines of grace stop being ideas and start becoming permission. If you listen closely, you may notice that God is often kind enough to start with questions rather than demands. Will you trust me if I say this relationship is not leading you where you think? Will you trust me if this door does not open the way you begged it to? Will you trust me if following me means being misunderstood by people whose approval you crave? He does not ask because he is unsure. He asks to draw what is hidden in your heart into the open. Dangerous prayers are born right there at the intersection of what you feel and what you know to be true about Him. Maybe like Edwards, you find your tongue stopping at key words. You can say, "Lord, guide me," but you hesitate to add, "even if your guidance undoes my plans." You can say, "Lord, bless my family," but struggle to continue, even if that blessing means exposing what we have tried to keep quiet. You can say, "Lord, make me holy," but flinch at, "even if holiness costs me what I thought I could not lose." Do not despise that hesitation. It reveals that you understand what is at stake. The prayer you fear is not a formula, it is a surrender of the steering wheel. So how do you move from fear to faith without pretending you are braver than you are? One step is to take your fear into the very sentence you have been avoiding. You can pray, "Lord, you know that I'm afraid of what I'm about to say. You know precisely which losses I dread and which idols I cling to. I confess that part of me wants to keep you at a safe distance from them. But I also know that I cannot be my own surgeon and survive. So starting here, I ask you, do what most glorifies you in me, even where I am afraid." That is not polished spirituality, that is truth, and God works with truth. Another step is to anchor that prayer in the cross. You're not handing your life over to an unknown power. You're entrusting it to the one who already proved his heart toward you. Romans chapter 8 verse 32 says, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, will graciously give us all things with him." The God who did not hold back his son is not now looking for ways to ruin you under the label of sanctification. He is looking for ways to free you from chains you barely recognize. Remembering that does not erase the pain of surrender, but it guards you from accusing his motives when the pruning begins. You will also need to decide what to do when the first answers to this prayer do not look spiritual at all. It may look like a job falling through, a relationship growing tense, a hidden sin finally coming to light. a season of dryness where easy emotions vanish. In those moments, your reflex will be to see only loss. But if you can pause before you write the story in your mind, you might be able to ask, Lord, is this one of the ways you are taking my words seriously? Is this how you are beginning to transform what I could not or would not surrender on my own? That question will not magically make the hurt disappear, but it will keep your heart open to the possibility of mercy in the middle of it. Over time, as you walk this way, something like what happened in Jonathan Edwards will happen in you. Your definition of a good season will shift. Before, a good season was when everything went according to your plan and your feelings cooperated. Now a good season becomes one in which, even through tears, you can see God cutting off branches that bear no real fruit and strengthening those that do. Before, your worst fear was that God would disrupt your script. Now, your deeper fear becomes that you might go an entire year or an entire life without being deeply changed. You do not have to be perfectly ready to pray this. No one ever has been. The point is not to wait until you feel no resistance, but to bring the resistance into the conversation with God and let Him win. The same Spirit who convicts you of half surrender is the one who will supply the courage to yield. In the next part, we will move even closer to that moment of decision, into a kind of prayer you can actually pray in your own words that echoes what changed Jonathan Edwards' destiny, and that, by grace, can begin to reshape the way you live, choose, and interpret every chapter from here on. There comes a point where circling around this subject is no longer enough. You can admire Jonathan Edwards' courage. You can feel the weight of his story. You can nod along to every verse we have mentioned, and still keep your own life carefully out of reach. At some point, this message becomes less about history and more about an appointment between you and God. Not you and your church, not you and your reputation, not you and your plans, you and the one who knit you together, who numbered your days, who already knows every idol you hope he will ignore. In that moment, the question becomes painfully simple. Do you want a God who cooperates with your agenda, or a God who saves you from yourself? You cannot have both. If you only want divine help to secure what you already decided is best, you may pray many words, but you will avoid the one line that would actually open the deepest doors of your heart. If, however, you have begun to suspect that your own wisdom is not safe, that your desires are not always reliable, that your version of the good life may be far too small, then the dangerous prayer stops sounding like a threat and starts sounding like a rescue. Perhaps you can feel that rescue pressing in even now. You think back on the seasons that almost broke you, and with new eyes, you wonder if they were already part of God taking you seriously before you even had language for it. Times when a relationship ended and years later you could finally see what it would have done to your soul. Times when a plan collapsed, and in hindsight, you realized how it had quietly become your God. Times when your sin was exposed, and though you were humiliated, you were also freed from a double life. Those were not comfortable chapters, but can you honestly say they were devoid of mercy? Now imagine facing the rest of your life with that same kind of mercy invited, not just tolerated. Imagine saying to God, I do not just accept your interruptions after they happen. I ask you to intervene before I destroy myself. That is what this prayer really is. An invitation for God to step into your blind spots on purpose. When Jonathan Edwards finally surrendered that way, he did not sign up for a neat, controllable story. He stepped into a future where God's commitment to his sanctification would sometimes clash with his preferences. The same will be true for you. But the alternative is a future where your preferences remain unquestioned, and that should frighten you more. It is important to be honest about this. Praying such a prayer will not always feel spiritual. It may feel, at first, like loss. You might pray it and then walk straight into a week where everything seems to go wrong. You may feel less blessed, not more. Inside, a voice will say, "See, this is what happens when you stop protecting yourself." That is why you must anchor your heart in what you know, not only in what you feel. You know that Christ did not spare himself to save you. You know that the Father disciplines those he loves. You know that the Spirit is committed to making you like Jesus, not simply making you comfortable. Those truths must run deeper than the shock of early answers. There is also a temptation in this place to delay indefinitely. You might say, "I agree with all of this. I will pray that prayer after this season, after this project, after this relationship is more stable." The problem is that your heart is learning every day, and what it learns from repeated delay is that obedience can always be postponed. You are training yourself to believe that half surrender is acceptable. Jonathan Edwards did not pray his dangerous prayer because he felt fully ready. He prayed it because he knew that waiting until he felt ready was another way of saying no with spiritual language. So, what might it sound like in your mouth to finally answer God's invitation? It might not be dramatic. You might whisper it on a commute, or kneel beside your bed, or sit alone in a car. The form of the words is less important than their honesty. It could be something like, "Lord, you know where I am afraid of you. You know what I protect. You know what I would rather lose you than lose. I confess that this is sin. I ask you to forgive me, and I ask you to take me at my word now. Do whatever most glorifies you in me. Cut away what keeps me from you, even if I protest later. Do not let me make peace with what is killing my soul." If you pray something like that, do not rush past it. Let it linger. Let the weight of it sit in the air. Then trust that God heard you. You do not need a thunderclap or a vision to confirm it. The same Lord who heard a young Jonathan Edwards wrestling centuries ago hears you now. And just as he wove that fearful surrender into the shaping of a destiny, he will weave yours into chapters you cannot yet see. The road from here will not be easy, but it will be honest. And whatever else it is, it will no longer be a story where you walk alone, asking God to bless a script you wrote. It will be a story where, page by page, he writes, corrects, and even tears out lines for your good and his glory. In the final part of this message, we will step fully into response, not only talking about surrender, but inviting you to mark this day with a declaration, a prayer, and a decision that by grace you will not spend the rest of your life running from the one sentence that could change everything. One day, perhaps much sooner than you think, you will stand where Jonathan Edwards now stands, not in a study with an open Bible, but before the God whose word searched him. On that day, all the prayers you prayed and the ones you refused to pray will be seen clearly. You will know exactly where you clung to your own script and where you let him write. The fog that surrounds your current choices will be gone. What will matter then will not be how safe your plans felt, but how deeply your heart was yielded to the one who loved you first. When that day comes, you will not find a God shocked by your weakness. He knows every fear that has held you back tonight. He knows the exact moment you almost surrendered and then pulled your hand away. He also knows the quiet, trembling yes that seems so small to you, but is enormous in heaven. He has never been interested in your performance as much as in your trust. The dangerous prayer we have been circling is not a test you must pass to earn his love. It is a doorway into living as someone who actually believes that love is real. So hear this clearly. The prayer Jonathan Edwards feared is, in the end, the safest place you can stand. Not safe from loss, not safe from tears, not safe from dying to yourself, but safe from the far greater tragedy of being handed over to your own illusions. Safe from a life where God is a supporting character in a story you wrote. Safe from the slow, respectable drift into a Christianity that never truly costs you anything and therefore never truly changes you. It is a dangerous prayer only to the parts of you that were never meant to survive the fire of His holiness. Tonight, that prayer is in front of you. You do not have to copy Edwards's exact words, but you must answer the same question. Will you trust God enough to hand him the pen? If you are willing, even with shaking knees, then let it sound something like this in your own mouth. Lord, I confess that I have been afraid of what your will might cost me. I've protected my plans, my idols, my image. Today I lay them down. Do whatever most glorifies you in me. Remove what keeps me from you, even when I resist. Do not leave me to myself. Make me more like Christ at any cost. If that echoes what is rising in your heart, I want you to mark this moment publicly, not to impress anyone, but to break the power of secrecy. Go to the comments and write this simple confession. I surrender my script to God. And don't. If you are in ministry or wrestling with something specific, add a few honest words about where this meets you. That sentence may be the line heaven points to years from now as the night you stopped asking God to decorate your story and finally asked him to own it. And if this message has met you in a way you cannot fully explain yet, if you sense that God is using Jonathan Edwards' trembling to confront your own, do not walk away and forget it. Stay close. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep walking through sermons that do not flatter your flesh but fight for your soul. Turn on the notifications, not for the sake of numbers, but so that, in the noise of your week, you will not miss the next time the Lord chooses to confront and comfort you through his word. Finally, think of one person who needs to hear this, a friend who is at war with God's will, a leader afraid of what obedience might cost. Someone who, like you, has been circling around surrender without ever stepping into it. Share this video with them as a quiet act of love, and let God use your courage to spark theirs. Your life from this point forward will still have storms, questions, and nights of wrestling. But if by grace you have whispered that dangerous, beautiful prayer, then you are no longer alone in guarding your destiny. The same God who took a trembling young Jonathan Edwards and used his surrendered life for eternal purposes stands ready to do the same with you. You do not have to know every step ahead. You only have to place your story in his hands and say, with fear and faith intertwined, write what most glorifies you and teach my heart to call it good.